Night stretched long over the fractured city, and word of the wanderer's kindness had begun to travel in whispers. Some dismissed it as a fleeting moment, while others swore it carried the weight of a prophecy. The boy who had received the bread clutched it close until dawn, sharing pieces with his frail sister hidden in the ruins of an old transit station. To her, the bread was more than food. It was proof that the world still held fragments of mercy. As the days passed, the boy searched for Eshin, but the wanderer had vanished like smoke. In his place remained only stories. The vendor who once mocked desperation now found himself haunted by the memory of the coat. At night, he draped it over his shoulders, yet its fabric burned with guilt rather than warmth. He began lowering his prices, offering food to those who had nothing, though he told no one why. Change had taken root where pride once ruled. Meanwhile, Eshin wandered further, drawn to a district where machines roared louder than voices. Here, laborers worked until their bodies broke, trading their hours for wages that barely bought survival. He watched a man collapse in exhaustion, ignored by those around him. Eshin knelt, giving water from his flask, and listened to the man whisper of a dream long forgotten freedom from the endless grind. For the first time in years, someone had heard him. That night, when the workers returned to their shacks, the man who had collapsed shared his encounter. A stranger had reminded him that he was more than a cog in the machine. His voice, trembling but alive, sparked something in the others. They began speaking of dignity, of change, of hope, things the overseers had long buried beneath silence. Far away, under the same dim glow of broken street lamps, the boy who once starved and the man who once collapsed carried the same seed in their hearts. A single act of compassion had begun to weave unseen threads, binding strangers together in a city that had forgotten what it meant to care. Soft wind rising, the hum of machines fading into distant echoes. The city lay beneath a sky of endless gray, where neon lights flickered against crumbling towers and forgotten streets. Among the shadows walked a man named Eshin, a wanderer with nothing but silence as his companion. He was known to drift from one district to another, never leaving behind more than footprints and unanswered questions. No one knew where he came from, yet whispers followed him like ghosts, claiming he carried stories older than time itself. One evening, as rain traced silver paths along broken glass, Eshin entered a market where the poor bartered scraps of metal for bread. He noticed a boy hunched over, clutching a small circuit board as if it were gold. The vendor laughed, mocking the child's desperation, and demanded far more than the trinket was worth. Eshin watched in silence, then stepped forward, placing his own worn coat on the counter. The vendor hesitated, greed wrestling with shame, before taking it and handing the boy a loaf of bread. The boy's eyes shimmered, not from hunger alone, but from the sudden kindness that had interrupted his despair. He asked why a stranger would give away the only thing keeping him warm. Eshin simply replied that warmth meant little if another had none at all. The boy clutched the bread and ran, leaving behind a spark that would ripple through the broken district in ways unseen. As Eshin disappeared into the mist, those who had witnessed the moment began to question their own choices. The vendor stared at the coat in his hands, feeling its weight like a burden on his conscience. A passerby whispered that perhaps the smallest act could change the course of a life. In a world drowning in shadows and machines, a single act of humanity glowed brighter than all the neon lights combined. Slow fade, footsteps echoing, rain softening into silence. The city's underbelly shifted restlessly, its alleys alive with whispers of a figure who walked without belonging. Some called him a ghost, others a drifter, but every story carried the same thread. He left behind change. Haessian moved unseen through crowded districts where neon signs sputtered and flickered, watching faces carved by hunger, greed, and forgotten dreams. He never stayed long, yet his presence left ripples in the silence. In one quarter, gangs ruled the night, their loyalty bought with fear. A young man named Kale had risen among them, hardened by betrayal and loss. Violence was the only language he knew, and his hands carried scars that spoke of battles fought too young. One evening, as Kale cornered a thief in the rain-slick alleys, blade in hand, Eshin appeared from the shadows. He asked Kale what victory there was in striking down someone already broken. The question lingered, heavier than the weapon in his grip. Kale hesitated, torn between reputation and the quiet pull of the words. His blade lowered, though rage boiled beneath his skin. The thief fled, leaving Kale with nothing but silence and the echo of a choice he did not understand. Days later, he found himself restless, unable to shake the memory of that stranger's calm voice. For the first time, he began to question the path he had chosen. Meanwhile, the boy who once clutched bread and the man who once dreamed of dignity were each moving in their own corners of the city, unknowingly connected by the same invisible thread. The vendor, too, had changed, no longer mocking those who came empty-handed. What began as a single moment of kindness had started to spread like fire through dry fields, touching lives that had never crossed. Ession continued his journey, unbound, leaving no trail but the transformations he ignited. He knew the city was listening, even if it did not yet understand. And somewhere in the distance, Kale stood beneath the broken glow of a neon sign, staring at his reflection in a blade he no longer wished to use. Something was stirring inside him, something he feared but could not deny. Low thunder rolls, the neon hum softens, footsteps fade into the rain. The city grew restless as night after night the whispers deepened. Ession's name passed from market stalls to factory floors, from the lips of children to the ears of the weary. Some swore he was a prophet from forgotten times. Others claimed he was nothing more than a drifter weaving illusions of hope. Yet every story carried weight, because behind each whisper stood a life already altered. Kale wandered alone, haunted by the moment his blade refused to fall. He no longer felt at home among his gang, whose laughter now rang hollow. One evening, under the flickering light of a rusted street lamp, he found Ession again. The drifter asked him not about power, nor about loyalty, but about freedom. Did Kale truly feel free in a life built on chains of fear? The question dug into him like a knife sharper than any he carried. Kale said nothing, but when dawn came, he walked away from his gang without looking back. Elsewhere, the boy and his sister shared their bread with others who had even less. The act spread through the ruins of their station shelter, where small kindnesses began replacing the hunger for survival at any cost. The man who once collapsed in the factory whispered courage to his fellow laborers, urging them to remember they were not machines, but people. The vendor, once hardened and cruel, now found comfort in giving more than he took. The city, once drowning in silence, was beginning to stir with voices long suppressed. Threads of change stretched across its veins, invisible yet unbreakable, binding together those who had once lived as strangers. All of them traced back to a figure who left no mark but whose presence lingered like firelight in the cold. From the rooftop of a crumbling tower, Ession watched the glow of neon against the mist. He knew the city was listening now, its pulse shifting, its spirit waking from a long sleep. Yet he also knew that the brighter the spark, the darker the shadows that would rise to smother it. Somewhere beyond the haze, forces that thrived on silence had begun to notice. Distant sirens echo, wind rushing past the rooftop, the city breathing heavier in the dark. Beneath the city's fractured skyline, shadows began to move with intent. The overseers who fed on fear had noticed the quiet changes spreading through the districts. Bread was being shared where once it was stolen, workers were speaking of dignity, gangs were thinning as members slipped away. What had begun as ripples now threatened to become waves, and waves could topple walls. No. They whispered about the wanderer, the man who left no trace, and decided he must be silenced before his stories grew into rebellion. Kale, now severed from his past, walked the streets with unease. He felt the emptiness of leaving violence behind, yet carried the weight of knowing it still lurked within him. One night he stumbled upon Ession again, seated by a dying fire in the skeleton of a burned-out station. Kale asked why he had been spared, why words had disarmed him more effectively than blades. Ession replied that every man carried two selves, one forged by pain and one waiting to be awakened by choice. Kale realized then that his life had never been his own. It had always been chained to the expectations of others. Meanwhile, the boy and his sister began to gather children like them, creating small circles where they shared scraps of food and stories of kindness. Hope became their currency, fragile yet more sustaining than bread alone. The factory worker, emboldened by the stranger's gift of listening, began to speak louder, calling meetings in the dim light where men and women dared to dream of rest and fairness. The vendor, weighed down by guilt but also freed by it, gave away his goods at night, leaving food on doorsteps where the starving slept. None of them knew of one another, yet each was part of the same quiet uprising. But the overseers grew bolder. Watchers were sent into the alleys, men in black cloaks who recorded whispers and followed trails of change. They sought the drifter, this Ession who walked between shadows, though he seemed to slip through their grasp like smoke. Still, they knew it was only a matter of time before the spark he had lit either burned the city bright or was snuffed out forever. Ession stood on a bridge overlooking the river of neon lights. He could feel the city stirring, caught between fear and awakening. He also knew that soon Those who fed on despair would come for the very people he had touched. The journey of morals was never meant to be safe, and the true test had yet to come. Low drums in the distance, river rushing beneath, the faint cry of sirens growing nearer. The city's nights grew heavier, each one wrapped in tension like a storm preparing to break. The overseer's watchers moved silently through the alleys, their eyes sharp, their ears hungry for whispers. They did not search for hope itself, but for the man who had dared to awaken it. And in their hunt, the people who had begun to change found themselves standing at crossroads they could not ignore. The boy and his sister returned one evening to find their shelter overturned, scraps of food scattered, and the small fire they had built stamped out. A warning had been left behind in the dirt, a crude mark carved to remind them that kindness had a price. Yet instead of silence, the boy gathered his circle of children closer and told them that fear was nothing more than a shadow large in shape but powerless in light. His words trembled, but his voice held steady, and those who listened found courage in its echo. Kale, restless since his last meeting with Eshin, discovered his old gang now working under the Watcher's command. They had been promised coin and protection in exchange for turning on the people who showed signs of change. Kay was approached to rejoin them, told that loyalty could erase his betrayal. Kay, for a moment, the fire of his old life flickered in his chest. But as he stood beneath the neon haze, he remembered Eshin's words about the two selves within every man. When the gang pressed him to choose, Kale walked away again, this time with no hesitation. At the factory, the worker who once collapsed began to speak openly, his voice rising over the machines. He urged his fellow laborers to remember their worth, reminding them that their silence fed the overseer's power. Fear rippled through the crowd, but so did the memory of exhaustion and hunger. For the first time, the machines slowed, their roar replaced by murmurs of defiance. The overseer's agents watched from a distance, noting every name, every face. Eshin moved quietly, watching the threads tighten, knowing the city was nearing its breaking point. He did not guide with orders, only with presence, and each soul he touched had begun to weave their own choices. Yet, he also knew that the overseers would not wait forever. Soon, the test would not be about kindness whispered in secret, but about courage shouted in the open. As the rain began to fall, washing the neon streets into rivers of fractured light, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Something was coming, and those who had felt the first spark of change would soon learn what it truly meant to carry it. Distant thunder rolling, rain intensifying, a hush spreading over the city like the pause before chaos. Rain swept hard across the broken skyline, drumming against steel and shattered glass, as if the city itself was warning of what was to come. The overseers had grown impatient. Watchers filled the streets, dragging those who dared to whisper change into the open squares. Their voices silenced beneath the crack of boots. Fear returned like a flood, but this time it met resistance. The people who had once hidden their hope now carried it in their eyes, and though their bodies trembled, their silence no longer obeyed. The boy and his sister stood among a crowd forced into the square. A watcher tore the bread from his hands, throwing it into the mud, declaring that charity was weakness. Yet the boy bent down, lifted the dirtied loaf, and broke it in half. Without a word, he gave one piece to his sister and offered the other to a stranger beside him. So small ignited something fierce. Murmurs spread, and soon others were stepping forward, sharing scraps, sharing courage, until the silence of fear cracked wide open. At the edge of the square, Cale appeared, no longer cloaked in the shadow of his old life. He stood against his former gang, blade drawn not for power, but for protection. When the watchers struck at the crowd, Cale fought not to kill, but to shield, each swing of his weapon cutting down the chains of his past. His defiance drew others to him, and the crowd surged, no longer a gathering of victims, but a tide of resistance. The factory worker raised his voice above the chaos, his words carrying like thunder across the square. He reminded them that they were not machines built to obey, but people with hearts, voices, and dignity. His cry became the spark that turned the crowd into a roar, and the overseers, though armored in fear, felt the ground shift beneath them. From the rooftops, Essien watched as the threads he had woven came together at last. He did not move to lead, for the lesson had never been about him. It was about the boy who dared to share bread in defiance, the man who spoke louder than machines, the vendor who gave instead of taking, and the fighter who found purpose beyond his blade. Their choices were now the city's story, written not in whispers, but in fire. The overseers retreated into the shadows, knowing the city had awakened, though the struggle was far from over. Essien stepped back into the mist, unseen yet present, a wanderer leaving behind not answers but echoes. And as the rain washed the neon streets clean, the city breathed with new life. Its people carrying the lesson forward that even the smallest act of kindness could become a revolution. Storms subsiding, footsteps fading into silence, the sound of many voices rising where once there had been none.